Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. We're going to wait until a few others kind of come on in. We were just enjoying a little Motown there. That always puts me in a good mood. I don't know about you. Looking at some of the wonderful words there. I love the word resilience, Christy. Nice. Breathe. Ha. Sometimes we take that for granted, but yes, breathe in, breathe out. You'd be amazed. I love the grateful. Thank you, Tia. Good morning to all of you. Hello to some of our DLA volunteers. Olga Diaz. Good morning, Olga. So good to see so many of you here today. We're going to give it just another minute and let everyone come on in and get settled. Grab your coffee because you are in for a presentation today. So go ahead and grab your coffee and let us know your one word. We'd love to know your one word. Good morning. Good morning. Let us know your one word. How are you feeling today? Let us know your one word. Socialized. David, thank you. Excellent. Wonderful. Thankful. Blessed always. LaJune, so good to see you, friend. Oh, we've got some old supporters in the house, old as in years that they've been working with GLA, not age. But so happy to see you all here. Good morning. Good morning to all of you. And welcome to Diversity Leadership Alliance and our 2023 webinar series on equity and social justice. After 21 years, yes, 21 years of driving progress around DEI, the conversations continue. And now we move into 2023 by creating DEI actionable items. As you all know, there's still much work to be done. For those that I do know and those that I have the pleasure of meeting this morning, my name is Joanna Deshay, and I am the Executive Director of Diversity Leadership Alliance, and I've had the great privilege of having this role for the past 8 years. Before I bring on our lovely and our amazing Education Committee Chair, Ms. Tandra Richardson, to kick off the program, I wanted to remind all of you in the DLA community that the conference is right around the corner. If you have not registered, if you have not had your companies register as a sponsor, there's still time. This year's conference is entitled Actions Speak Louder, where we will be creating sustainability around equity and inclusion. And that's going to be on Thursday and Friday, November 2nd and 3rd. Ashley, the lovely Ashley, who's assisting us, will post the link to the conference right there. Thank you, Ashley. Definitely check out all of the workshops that we have. And we've just got some great topics for workshops. And this is the first year we're going to do an in-person piece on Friday, November 3rd. So we're very excited about that. We have not gathered, right, since the pandemic. So we are really thrilled to be able to do so. The 22nd Annual Diversity Leadership Alliance Conference, that's right, 22 years, will be an impactful gathering dedicated to driving positive change in our communities and organization. By bringing together thought leaders, experts, and passionate advocates, we will explore innovative strategies, share best practices, and ignite meaningful conversation that inspire systemic change. I want to just give a special thank you to our presenting sponsors this year. We could not do any of this work without them. So a special thank you to Mayo Clinic, Channel 12 News, and Salt River Project. Thank you so much. Sponsorship packages, I mentioned, are still available, and I invite you to contact me for any additional information if you would like to support conference this year. So thank you all for that, and thank you for allowing me to welcome you into our space. Good morning. Now, I would love to welcome to the screen to join us today's moderator, who is also a DLA board member and the esteemed co-chair of our Education Committee. Good morning to you, Tandra, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Joanna, for such a warm welcome. My name, as Joanna stated, is Tondra Richardson. I'm a Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Phoenix and a proud DLA board member and the 2023 co-chair of the DLA Education Committee. Welcome. For those of you who have been with us for a while, we'll soon be announcing a new co-chair for that committee, so stay tuned. Diversity Leadership Alliance exists to bring a voice to marginalized communities, provide a forum for constructive dialogue, and eradicate racism through strategic professional development workshops. Together with our business and community partners, we enhance the workplace and highlight the value of diversity as an essential part of any successful business model. We intend to cultivate change agents ready to lead with a renewed sense of bravery, urgency, and empathy. Through these vital monthly workshops, our annual conference, and youth leadership program, we provide a safe space and a platform to have critical conversations that impart change. Now, before we begin today's DLA webinar, I'd like to acknowledge and identify the Indigenous peoples, nations, and histories within our area. We acknowledge the Akimel Udhim, Pipash, and Yavapai. We acknowledge these people, their ancestors, their descendants, and the land itself. At DLA, we're all about progression, and we want our DLA community to know that we're working to move beyond just an acknowledgement and to actions for our Indigenous communities. I apologize in advance that I may not be with you all through the duration of the program, as I have a previous engagement to attend, but not to worry, as you all will be in the very capable hands of our DLA Executive Director, Joanna Deshay, who may be closing out the program after our presenter's PowerPoint presentation. I will, however, try to stay on for the duration because you are in for a treat today. Now, our sixth DLA workshop of 2023 is about going beyond performative DEI gestures and tokenism in order to create authentic spaces where DEI is not just a buzzword. Before we begin, we just want to remind everyone that Diversity Leadership Alliance is a community education nonprofit organization. And as such, we want to ensure that our programs and our events are inviting, respectful, and accessible to all. Let's take just a few minutes to remind everyone about our community rules of engagement. And we'll put those up on the screen, or excuse me, we'll put those in the chat for you to take a look at. I won't read through all of them, but I do want to highlight a few. We want to make sure that we commit to foster greater empathy. Ask questions and seek clarification for understanding. You'll get an opportunity both throughout and at the end of this presentation. We want to make sure that we understand that as a community space, we do reserve the right to remove you from the discussion if you become disruptive. Although we hope that we won't have to do that, we are open to all perspectives and we look forward to engaging in the content today. Our September DLA webinar explores the crucial concept that equity is not a trend, and that true equity goes beyond surface level performative gestures and tokenism. Inclusion and diversity efforts should not be seen as fleeting trends, but rather as fundamental values that shape the fabric of our organizations and societies. By understanding the depth of equity, we can foster genuine representation, meaningful inclusion, and equitable opportunities for all individuals. In this interactive webinar, we will explore how to move beyond superficial diversity efforts and instead cultivate a culture of genuine equity and lasting inclusion. We'll also examine the detrimental effects of treating diversity as a mere trend and explore practical strategies to embed equity as an integral part of an organization's core values. Participants will gain a deeper understanding of the obstacles that can hinder long-term progress in DEI efforts and explore the impact of systemic inequalities. By attending today's webinar, you are committing to learn how to create authentic, inclusive spaces where equity is not just a buzzword, but a guiding principle for organizational growth and success. Just one more time for the people in the back. Equity is not just a buzzword, but a guiding principle for organizational growth and success. Now I have the honor of introducing you to our speaker for today. I have to say, this is a leader who I had the privilege of engaging with and experiencing in person at a conference a couple of years ago, and also had the pleasure of running into her at the same conference last year. I'm very excited to bring this to you all here at DLA. Dr. Kimberly Nao, educator and consultant, is currently the Fritz Burns Endowed Chair Associate Professor of Education at Mount St. Mary's University, where she teaches courses on ethnic studies, language diversity, linguistics, and teacher professional development. She is also a MSMU Diversity Fellow, providing professional learning opportunities in diversity, equity, and inclusion for students, faculty, and staff at the Mount. She's worked extensively on diversity and equity issues with a particular emphasis on the intersection of race and gender, and facilitates discussions on these issues with organizations throughout the LA area. She's trained K-12 teachers, Santa Monica Police Department police officers, community college faculty and staff, healthcare workers, and parents of K-12 students on issues related to gender, sexuality, and toxic masculinity, with the goal of breaking down gender norms that can lead to rigid gender roles, discrimination, and violence. As a yoga and mindfulness teacher, Kimberly believes that self-awareness and compassion for others leads to social transformation. I'm now going to turn you over to the very capable hands of Dr. Kimberly Nao. I do want to also add that after you hear today's presentation, feel free to reach out to her. This presentation and what she offers is something we need in our organizations. Kimberly?
Thank you so much, Tandra. It's so great to be here. And I also want to thank Joanna Deshay for inviting me here and welcoming me so nicely. And I want to thank Ashley, too, who's here helping out with the technological aspects of this presentation. But most of all, thanks to all of you for being here this morning. I know we're all very busy people. And so I think it's really important that we're present and ready to do the work. And I just really want to emphasize that although I do have experience and expertise around issues related to DEI and anti-racism as a consultant based here in Los Angeles, I see each of you in this room, this virtual room, as experts as well, because I know you're all engaged in the work as well. So please feel free throughout this presentation to share your wisdom in the chat with each other and with me. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom world, and I'll be sure to try and get to them. Between Ashley and myself, we'll try and get to as many of your comments as I can. I'm so excited to see the energy that's already in the room with the words that you're sharing, including the word breathe, which, as Tandra mentioned, is an important word for me as a mindfulness instructor. And I hope that we breathe through these difficult topics, because as we know, sometimes this discussing race and other intersections of our social identities can be difficult. So please take care of yourself through this time. Now, we know that you've chosen this theme, equity is not a trend. And I think it's such a key theme because it speaks to the fact that there is this declaration that needs to be made rather than a reality that already exists. Because for some organizations, equity was just that, a trend. It was a box to check or a one-size-fits-all approach or a performative gesture. And so what we'd like to proclaim this morning is that equity is an ongoing commitment and is more than just an add-on. It's something that should be infused in the work of every area of any given organization. So no, equity is not a trend. Anti-racism is not a fad. And as Dr. King told us, the time is always right to do right. And so today you're all taking that first step to do right, as you do, I'm sure, every day by being present in this webinar. So today what I hope to do is to share a little bit of the approach to the work that I engage in as a consultant. So we'll look a little bit about how it came to be that we're thinking of equity as a trend in some ways. I'll talk about my reflexive approach to engaging in the work. And we'll also do our own self-exploration, our own self-assessment around who we are as leaders and who we are as individuals within the field. So I just want to start with that question. Who is in the room? Who are you? Many of you may know each other, but I don't know you. So if in the chat, you'd please put, what's your role at your institution? And what is your relationship to the work that you do? So to the DEI work. So are you a DEI leader? Are you a DEI facilitator? Maybe you're still on the learning journey. So if in the chat, you can just put, what's your role at your institution? Who are you? And how do you relate to this work? So please put your title, anything that you want to share about who you are. And I'm already beginning to see a few of you sharing. Manager, DEI manager, a DEI analyst. That's interesting. I want to hear more about that. Lead outreach and education coordinator for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Nice. I was looking at your website today, Krista. Director of Academic Operations, Director of Equity and Inclusion. So a lot of people that directly do this work within their role, have specific roles within the work. Director of Latino Studies, Senior Director of Culture. Nice. It's so great to see all of these people, not just DEI, with not just DEI titles, but who have titles in other areas interested in this work. Thank you for sharing. So continue to share if you choose, but you'll also see that there was a poll put into the Zoom. And this is because I really want to acknowledge that we're more than our titles, right? Many of us go to dinner parties and first thing we're asked is, what do you do? What's your title? But we know that we're more than that. And so because we're more than that, all these titles that I'm seeing appear in the chat, behind that are people who belong to various social groups. Each of you belongs to various social groups. So my question for you this morning is, which of the social groups that you see in this poll do you most strongly identify with? So when you enter a room, perhaps, what's the identity that you tend to lead with? What is the most salient identity for you? What is the identity you're most conscious of when you enter the room? So you should be seeing a poll up there. Choose the identity that you kind of identify with the most. And I'm seeing Sergio is already putting it in the chat. You can do that as well. If not, please feel free to do it on the poll. So Sergio said he chose other and put urban, which I find, I like that one, right? You know, to be urban. I always considered myself a city girl, and now I love nature. So we can also shift identities. Linda has put that age is important to her. So go ahead, and in the poll, it'll be anonymous. So you can just go ahead and put which is the most important to you. Mira says that she's a believer in God. That's the one that's most important for her. Okay, so let's see now, give you, let's have an opportunity to see what the results of the poll are. Okay, so out of those who did share, it looks like race was the most salient identity for most of us. So 42% of us said that race was the most salient identity. Second up was gender. So many of us identify with our gender identity. And so that is the second group, with age and then sexuality following, and then religion and the job position. The thing that I asked about first, you related to the least. So I find that really interesting, right? Because we're so often asked to define ourselves by our positions. And yet, look what we often lead with when we enter a room, our gender and our race, among other identities. What do you make of this? What is important to you as you look at this? What stands out for you? And if you like, you can also raise your hand and maybe we can see if we can spotlight someone. But you can also just put in the chat, what do you notice about how we all identified? Did anything surprise you? Was anything interesting to you? Why did I even ask that question? Why was it important to you? So Janae says, each of my identities are equally important to me. So I love this response. Janae, if you'd like to say more about that, raise your hand and we can spotlight you. Kiara says, or is it Kira? BIPOC are often disproportionately tasked with the emotional labor of DEI work, informally or formally. Thank you for sharing that. That's so key, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. My job is not challenged by social norms or political groups. Interesting. If Lisa, you'd like to say more about that, then please feel free to raise your hand and we can spotlight you. So I see Janae has her hand up. Ashley, can we spotlight Janae and get her input? Janae, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Shanae Stevenson. I am from South Phoenix Healthy Star under the umbrella of Maricopa County Public Health. The reason why I said all of my identities are equally important to me is because even though I am in public health, I come from a more political sciencey social justice background. And I have been studying about intersectionality and the ways that my identities correlate with one another and also affect me. So even though I'm perceived in the public and different communities a certain way, I don't take that value or attribute that value and internalize it. And because it's what I do, I try not to do that for other people. I try to ask them how their values are, and understand all the context of what is important to them, because there's so much more than people are so much more than how we are perceived.
Thank you so much, Janae. And I love that you say that you start from a standpoint of asking people how they view themselves, right? Because one of the things that I always notice with this poll is that many of us say different things. We lead with different things, and that's going to shape how we interact with others. So thank you for bringing that point up. I think Lisa also wanted to share. So feel free to unmute yourself, Lisa, if you'd like to share.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was interesting that it kind of didn't even occur to me that my job and hierarchy would come first. And I think that that's part of, the reason I think that way is because of allyship. So for example, as a white woman, I mean, certainly there are rights and privileges for women that are under fire all the time. And so I feel like those things, fighting for human rights, people's rights, justice, especially in America at this time, overrides all of that. So my job position is a wonderful thing. I love what I do, but I don't have to advocate for myself there. I don't have to advocate. I don't think I have to fight for it. Whereas everything else, immigration status, race, sexual identity, we have to fight for those things right now to be safe and for just general rights in those areas. So I think those are so critical in this political arena right now.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for sharing that. And I agree with you that the thing that stands out for us often is the thing that we have to fight for, the area where we feel most marginalized. And Jesus also said that in the chat, that we identify the most with our most visible identities or the identity that makes us part of vulnerable groups. So thank you for sharing that. And Eddie says, race is very important to me because I want to be in a space where I don't want to be second guessed. So these point to why sometimes we tend to most identify with an area that that is marginalized or vulnerable. So Anissa says, I'm most recognized by my religious identity because of my religious dress, hijab. However, as a Black American, this is a significant part of who I am. I am almost always the only Black American Muslim hijabi woman in my professional circles. And I love that, what you say there, Anissa, because what you're getting to, again, is this idea of intersectionality, which Janae pointed to, and that even within the groups that we say we most strongly identify with, we often have another layer, another identity group that impinges on or impacts how we're viewed within that group. So we can be both marginalized and privileged within a particular group. So I think it's very important, Anissa, that you brought out that point. And then David is bringing a point. I have a daughter who's transitioning to male and a son who is transitioning to female. Why am I having a hard time wrapping my head around my son's transition and not my daughter's? I don't judge and I support both, but somehow I think there is a screw loose. I don't know. David, I actually don't think there's a screw loose. I think that what we're all struggling with in this realm, and I wanted to bring it up because it moves beyond race to think about gender, is this, again, this way that we look at males versus the way that we look at females, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for behavior for both groups. And often males have a more narrow range of ways that they're able to express themselves given the expectations on males. So I really do find it interesting that you have a harder time wrapping your head around your son's transition than your daughter's. I think it speaks to the way that gender roles work within a society like the US. So there's, again, I said to you that I would not be the purveyor of all wisdom in this chat, in this room. And I can see that that's the case. You all are coming with such really, really important points. And I'm, if I've missed any, let's hold on to them, because I think we will have an opportunity to come back to them. But I would like to just point out something that that has kind of been said implicitly through each of your responses, and that is that we view our world through the lens of our experiences. So many of us take our experiences or have experiences based on our identities. As a woman, I experience sexism. As an African-American woman, I experience racism through a particular lens of being a woman. And so those experiences mean that I'm going to have views around what it's like to be a woman, what it's like to be Black. And those views are going to shape my intentions. And those intentions have been shaped by the fact that those two identity groups are often marginalized. And I have to, as Lisa said, take action. I have to fight for those identities. And so that sets my intentions. And my intentions, again, will shape my experiences. So we also have David, who's having new experiences and having to reshape his views around gender, which is going to lead to new intentions. And so at any point in this cycle of intentions that Oren J. Sofer outlines in his book, Say What You Mean, at any point of the cycle, we can intervene to shape our intentions so that we then shape our experiences and perhaps change the way that we view things. And again, notice here that I'm talking about ourselves, changing ourselves and not necessarily changing the views of others, because we cannot control that. But we can control how we view and experience the world, and therefore our intentions within it. So I want to take as an example the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because we all came to this moment of needing to assert, hey, equity is not a trend. We came to this moment because at a point, it seemed like it became a trendy thing, right? If you recall, back in March of 2020, we had a historic thing happen globally where we had the global pandemic, which has been referenced earlier by when Joanna said, well, you'll finally be able to meet in person. Well, back in March, the whole world shut down due to COVID-19. And what that allowed us to do was we sat in our homes and we sat and we watched the world kind of unfold before us on our computers, on social media, on the media, right? We saw a lot of significant events occurring during this quarantine phase. Some of us were making, sourdough bread, or engaging in new hobbies, but others of us were seeing some real significant events unfold. One was that almost immediately we saw anti-Asian sentiment around the COVID-19 spread. You know, Asians were being blamed for the spread of the infection or the origin of the infection. And here within the US, we saw a spike and a rise in Asian hate crimes. So, anti-Asian hate crimes. We also saw almost immediately a disparity in who was affected by the COVID infection. So we saw that our essential workers, who very often were Black, Indigenous people of color, were more at risk for having the infection, but then also were more at risk for being hospitalized, were receiving less care. So we saw some very different disparate outcomes for different groups in relationship to COVID-19. At the same time, we saw people protesting having to wear masks. We saw people who interestingly seemed to have an overlap with an identity of whiteness and an identity of a right-wing point of view, were protesting wearing masks, were protesting quarantining, and at the same time doing so with racist insignia often on their t-shirts, armbands, flags, etc. So there was this interesting convergence of response to COVID based on our worldviews in terms of race. We also saw, if you recall, this moment where this woman, Amy Cooper, a white woman in Central Park, weaponized her privilege by threatening to call the police on a gentleman who was a bird watcher, asking her to please put your dog on a leash. And with that weaponization of her privilege, it became starkly clear that the police could be called by a white woman who threatened, I'm going to call the police on you and say that you're threatening me. She knew the power of that threat for that African-American male. And so it pointed to the different ways that different groups are treated by the police. But we also had some very violent examples of different ways that people were treated by the police. We saw the killing of Breonna Taylor, and we eventually saw in May of 2020, the killing of George Floyd. As this video went viral, as we're all sitting at home, and many of us were able to see the almost casual killing by this police officer of George Floyd because he had his knee on George Floyd's neck. Now, this led to a nationwide response around the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement that was started in 2013 in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin, whose killer was acquitted for that killing. So the Black Lives Matter movement had gone from a small movement to a national movement and then to a global movement as nations around the world saw their marginalized people relating to George Floyd, relating to this moment. And people were protesting in the streets and calling for meaningful change. What you may have also noticed in that time was some significant shift in discourse around race in this country. And you saw corporations, schools, even the media thinking about new ways of talking about race and talking about race in new ways. It was now starkly evident that America had a very serious problem, as Toni Morrison calls it, when it comes to race. What were some performative gestures that you saw, because many occurred after the George Floyd killing? What were some performative changes and gestures that you experienced or you heard about, or maybe even participated in at this time in response to the George Floyd killing? Because many organizations did respond, but many of those responses were performative. So someone's bringing up the Black Instagram squares, right? I do recall that. Anything else? What were some other performative gestures within organizations besides just those Instagram squares? Okay, the We Stand in Solidarity messages, yes. So almost every organization felt a need to have, as Kira is saying, a DEI statement, a solidarity message, promises to improve DEI efforts, Christy's saying, giving voices to marginalized staff, but not improving things necessarily. Although Christy's saying improving hiring practices, hiring more POC, hiring DEI professionals, but not giving them power to act, Jackie says. Creating DEI positions without funding and limited scope, Ken says. So we're really seeing that creating jobs without meaning, Benita says. White coats for Black Lives movement of silence. White coats for Black Lives movement of silence. I actually hadn't heard about that one, Zoe. If you'd like to talk more about that, you can. Funding to vulnerable populations while major systemic push back on anything related to the root of the issue. Okay. And then created a DEI council without proper funding. So lots of talking about creating positions and creating committees, but not supporting or funding these organizations. Zoe, did you want to chime in here?
Sure. I just wanted to clarify my comment. So the White Coats for Black Lives moment of silence was a national moment where physicians and providers walked out of hospitals and clinics and kneeled for 8 minutes and however many seconds in quote unquote solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened to George Floyd. And then that was it. They did that. They took their photos and they went back to work.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. These photo ops, which Jesus is also referring to, the photo op of the Congress members kneeling with the kente cloth during the movement. Amplifying performatively, asking for our opinions with no real interest in what was said, because it brought around accountability and no true intention of change, Devana says. So you all really were witness to and perhaps experienced a lot of these performative gestures. I remember hearing about listening sessions, right? And I think a couple of people were referring to that. Let's listen to our community and see what our community has to say, but then not really making substantive change after that. I think of Pride gear too, the Pride gear wearing rainbow flags as also performative. Book clubs, right? How many of you heard of book clubs, participated in book clubs, facilitated? I facilitated a book club around anti-racism, but what kind of change does that actually make? So if anyone wants to share any statements anonymously, you can feel free to share it with the host and panelists, and then we will share out your response without sharing out who said your response. And so other things that I will talk about also are anti-bias trainings and the one-shot deal workshop. Okay, so many of us have experienced these one-shot deal workshops where someone comes in, much like myself, and does a one-shot workshop and then leaves, and the organization doesn't move any further than that. So all of these gestures are performative at worst, can backfire at worst, but some of them can be strategic, So for example, I do think it's important for people to wear Pride gear as a sign of visibility, but I think that that's only part of a larger change that needs to occur. So I'm not saying none of these things are good things, but I'm saying that these things alone will not lead to the kind of structural change that we really need to see within our organizations. So we need to be strategic and intentional. It's so interesting that when we were talking about what is your one word for 2023, my word that popped in my head was intentional, because that is where I feel like a lot of the trends in DEI work have remained trends, is when we have not been intentional and strategic about the events that we plan, about the interventions that we plan, and how have these interventions truly led to structural change. So Elizabeth says, I was able to participate in an anti-bias for education book club. It was super helpful to give teachers words to support anti-bias in the classroom. Thank you, Elizabeth, because you're helping me make the point that I was just making, which is that a book club is not bad in and of itself, we do need to align language when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about DEI. And so these are steps within a larger system of steps that need to take place, because as we saw after the Black Lives Matter movement, much of what occurs is systemic. It's not just about changing individual attitudes, because there are whole systems at play. And the example that I bring to kind of share that point is the January 6th insurrection. So, several months after the George Floyd incident, what we had was many people feeling like they had to storm and stop the democratic process that was occurring on the Capitol. And they did so by violently storming the Capitol. But what we saw is that many of the people that did so had racist insignia on them as they did this, right? Many of the people that did so were people who are police officers, right? Many of the people that did so are people who were goaded on by people in our Congress. So what we saw is that these were not random people that just sort of at one point decided angrily to storm the Capitol, but that there was a whole system of events put into place within the system of our government even, and in some of our institutions, that led to this insurrection. And so what we know is that structural racism is just that. It's not just about individuals having prejudices, but it's about the ways that these prejudices get infused into our institutions. So I'm seeing some comments in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of action and I'm loving it. I'm seeing a lot of people responding to each other. Please continue to do so. But I'd also like for us to think now with the January 6th insurrection, were there any things that you noticed about that insurrection that pointed to systemic issues? Now, I've already brought up, some of the people who were involved. Were there any other incidents within that insurrection that pointed to systemic issues around race? And that kind of lead to us understanding that we had a bigger problem than prejudiced people reacting to an incident. So Lisa says the defense was that they were good citizens because they were white, perhaps. Okay. Christy says there was a lack of response for police authorities despite the forewarnings that appeared in social media. Great point, right? Which is very different from the response to the Black Lives Matter protesters. The fact that it even happened is a systemic issue, Ashley says. Had it been a group of people of color, it would have ended in a massacre. Angela says the resources used to take care of that situation was far less than the resources they used for protests. So yes, that's something that was very, very evident, right? Is the lack of response to this incident as opposed to the Black Lives Matter incident that preceded it. So what we see too is that the ways that we are looking back at this incident, again, are shaped by our identities and by our social groups, right? Many of us are seeing, as a person of color, I know the response was different than it would have been if people of color had been protesting. And there are people who are noticing that as white people, these people were responded to differently as well. So we have this continued look, this continued lens that we all use to see this incident through. And I think that this becomes very important when we think about the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement became a trend around this time frame. So what we noticed is that from 2020, when George Floyd was killed, to 2023, where we currently are, there's been a 16% drop in the approval rating of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that drop happened pretty quickly. If you look here, you'll see that there was a 67% approval rating of the Black Lives Matter movement in June of 2020, just after George Floyd had been killed. But by September, that dropped to a 55% approval rating of the Black Lives Matter movement. So what we already saw and what we continue to see is a drop off in the understanding of the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement, or a drop off in an interest in the Black Lives Matter movement. And if we, again, look at this through a lens of our identities and our social groups, we can break this down through the by race. So what you see here is just the overall approval rating for the Black Lives Matter movement in June of 2020, which was at 67% for all adults. But look where it was for African Americans in June of 2020. It was at 86%. And for whites, it was at 60%. So the majority of white people even saw the value of the Black Lives Matter movement. But by September, that number dropped to 45%. And for African Americans, it actually had gone up to 87%. So once again, what we're seeing is that our lens through which we view the importance of these issues is shaped by our own experiences and our own social groups. This is 2023. Look where African Americans are still with noticing the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. At 81% of African Americans are still believing that the movement is an important one. Whereas for most of the other groups, the drop that occurred in September of 2020 has been maintained. And so it's a really interesting statistic to note. Christine is saying Pew is very good in polling, but I wonder if they have sliced and shared data by age. Younger adults and teens have lens that is, in this moment, is a thing in their lives, a given. And Christine, yes, you know what? This slide, I actually shortened it because it did include age, and it also included political party. So by age, you're right, that the younger groups tended to see the Black Lives Matter movement as still more relevant and salient. So thank you for bringing up that point. It's another way that we can do a cross-section and look at this idea of intersectionality. So even though we might say all adults have a drop in support for Black Lives Matter, what about the youth, right? And when we look at that for the youth, we can see that across race, the youth are more invested in the Black Lives Matter movement than older adults. So thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Christine. So again, the headlines tell us currently, when we look at what's been going on since the Black Lives Matter movement, that there is the fierce urgency of now upon us. That's what African Americans understood in 2020. That's what they understood in 1956. And that's what they understood in 1619, that the fierce urgency of now is always upon us and that it is not just a trend. Many of us have always known this. Women, immigrants, trans folks, LGBTQ, other LGBTQ folks have always felt the backlash in moments of this, especially now, where we're having this response to a quote woke agenda. And so what we're seeing now is that when we look through an intersectional lens, these statistics, this data, this information, as the young folks say, hits different, right? It hits a little different for different folks. So when we think about intersectionality, what we're referring to is a term that Kimberly Crenshaw used to talk about a frame, she said, that allows us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group. Many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation without such frames. But it doesn't have to be this way, she says. She says, many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality, and thank you, Janae, for highlighting this, to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. So Ken is bringing out the point that intersectionality has become a bad word. And I'll also say that intersectionality has become a trendy word, right? A buzzword, as Tandra was calling them. And so any of these trendy words, any of these buzzwords, any of these words that actually really help us point to a problem, then becomes a bad word, right? Because it points to a problem that maybe some don't want us to see. And the problem that some don't want us to see is that when our social groups overlap, what we have is we have points of relation to each other, points of where we can not only within ourselves but within groups understand that our problems intersect and that the root of our problem can be pointed to more succinctly so that we don't leave other people out. And Kira, and please forgive me, Kira, if I'm mispronouncing your name, but you say so many people misuse intersectionality too to mean my multiple identities when that's not what it's all about. That's true. People use intersectionality simply to talk about our different identities, which is part of it. But the most important part that Kimberly Crenshaw pointed to was the power dynamic within those identities, how those identities intersect in relations to power, in relation to oppression. So that's really important to bring out. So what I like to use, because intersectionality points to such a complicated way of looking at issues, is I like to use what I refer to as a reflexive approach to understanding how to address these issues from a DEI space. And so I call it a reflective and a reflexive approach, because yes, we can all reflect on our identity and who we are and why we experience what we experience. But we really have to think of our identity in relationship to others and our identity in relationship to power and systems of power. So what you see from this graphic is if you're in the center here, this is you with all of your intersecting identities. You then go out into your workplace. You go out into other spaces as well, but for the purposes of this presentation, we'll talk about your workplace. And what you notice here is that when you go out into your workplace, you are now interacting with others on the basis of those multiple identities. But not only are you interacting with others differently, but other people are interacting with you differently based on that. And outside of all of that, we have society's ideologies, we have the social forces, we have media, we have culture, and we have the lens of history that also impacts on who we are. And so all of that needs to be taken into account when we think about an approach to DEI training. We can't have a one-pronged approach that just looks at identity and can we all get along within our different identities. We have to have an approach that also says, within these identities, there are different systems of power that impact us differently, and we have to acknowledge that. So I'm seeing some pretty hefty conversation happening. Krista, if you would like, will you please unmute and share what you're saying about the EEOC and what you're stating here? Because I'm seeing lots of text and I'd love to hear your voice on that if you'd like. Krista may not be able to unmute. So I'll read the point. Krista is saying, the commission recognizes that certain protected bases overlap and negative stereotypes and biases may be directed at more than one protected basis at a time. That is such an important point to bring out. Krista, did you unmute there for a second?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so just wanted to acknowledge at EOC that when we're looking at employment discrimination cases, that we do look at intersectionality, and that there are times where we're going to find discrimination based on two protected classes and not just one, like the example that was in the chat. So I basically did a copy and paste from our guidance, but I just wanted to make it known that when it comes to employment discrimination, that you can be discriminated against because you're an African American female, but they don't discriminate against African American men. So it can be a combination of two protected classes that result in discrimination. You know, add age, add disability, you know, any of those things, pregnancy. You know, I treat white women more favorably than people of color who are pregnant, you know, those kind of things. So
thank you for bringing that up, Krista. And again, the wisdom of the room coming forward, because those kinds of cases, the case where an African-American woman was actually suing an organization due to discrimination. And what happened was when she sued the organization said, well, we already have remedies for women, and we already have remedies for Black people. So this Black woman suing does not have a grounds. What she's asking for is sort of a double protected class experience, which would be unfair to women and to Black people for her to be treated differently in this way. So she lost her case. That is actually the case that Kimberly Crenshaw used to come up with the term intersectionality. She used that case to say that we actually do need to consider the ways that gender and race are interacting. So thank you so much for bringing up the EEOC's position on that. Lisa also talked about how our identities can be in conflict, and says that the feminist movement became focused on white women, which didn't support intersectionality and others. So, you know, and that is very true, that many of our movements become narrowly focused. And sometimes, again, for good reason, because it's important to be strategic in certain instances. But when you leave out the experiences of women of color or lesbian women or trans women within that, then are you truly discussing, you know, supporting women, or are you discussing supporting particular groups of women? Okay, so let's see, again, the chat, I'm monitoring the chat at the same time as I'm moving forward with the presentation, because the chat is so rich, and I hope you're all kind of reading the chat as well. So I just want to move on now to talk a little bit about this reflexive approach and why it's important in the workplace. So when we look at who we are within our individual identity groups, and we think about, well, how reflexively, how am I going out into my workspace? How am I as a Black woman impacting other people who are different from me? How am I as a white person, you know, interacting with other people different from me? But also, how is who I am impacting how other people relate to me? And I'm seeing some, you know, really great self-reflection, really great consciousness around the ways that people are engaging with these questions. And I would expect that, right, from the Diversity Leadership Alliance. But it's so important that we examine ourselves to better communicate with our colleagues and our clients. We really do have to examine who we are, and we have to examine our role within the institution, and then how that institution is serving others. So again, I could ask you, those groups that you chose, for example, many of you chose either gender or race as areas that were most salient for you. How are you either marginalized or privileged within those groups? I loved that we already had an example when we were talking about being Muslim and Black. Are there other examples of ways that you experience being marginalized or privileged within your own, within the group that you most identified with? So again, keep it moving, keep that chat going. Within, it could be examples within your workplace, ways that you see your gender operating differently. And at this point too, I will take people that would like to raise their hands and share out, because again, this is a lot to put in the chat. So are there ways that you notice your gender operating in relationship to your race? Are there ways that you're feeling marginalized within your race, privileged within your race? Let's move forward with that. Anyone would like to share? Okay, Allison is saying, I am biracial, so sometimes I do feel marginalized by each. Allison, I'm also biracial. My mother's Japanese. You notice that I did not lead with being biracial. I led with my African-American identity. Part of that is due to how I see myself, but part of that is due to how others see me. You know, so we notice that identity is this thing that goes back and forth. It's not just about how we see ourselves, but how others see us, right? So I'm seeing Allison is Filipino and African American. I'm Japanese and African American. So other people with, so we can be, now I'm going to acknowledge too that makes me in some ways privileged within that group, right? Because of the way racism works, I can sometimes be viewed as privileged within the African American group due to being biracial. And sometimes I can feel marginalized within that group by being biracial. So it's important to look at the different ways that those play out. I do think that I get a certain amount of privilege from that. Clyde talks about age affording privilege. I think that's important to realize, so that even within your race, you might have an age group. For example, a younger Black male might have very different experiences than an older Black male. Would anyone like to unmute and talk about any of this verbally? Mira's bringing out being middle-aged, entering into middle age, and noticing how much we value the sexualized identity of women. So it's freeing in some ways because the reality of what is valued in our society is further clear. Great point. Jesus is saying, my sexuality is in conflict with the values of my ethnicity. Machismo and patriarchy is ingrained in Hispanic Latino culture. I also experience privilege in having education, which my ethnic group is underrepresented in. And because of that, like a lot of BIPOC, I am often told I am well-spoken, articulate, eloquent, when someone who is white would often just be called a good speaker or a great presenter. Thank you, Jesus, for bringing that up. There's a lot there. You bring up a lot of intersections. And I think too, it's important to acknowledge our privilege. I used to think that my education level was something that I just really worked really hard for. And I'm not going to say that I didn't work hard for it, but I was privileged of being born in the US, being born in Los Angeles, having access to higher education, going to the particular schools that I went to. All of those things were privileges and not things that I earned. And so it helped me understand how some things that people think, well, I just worked hard for that. Yes, you did, but you also had privileges along the way that allowed you to move forward.
Now we've got Sharon that's ready to share with you. If you'd like to hear Sharon's comments. And so Ashley will go ahead and unmute you, Sharon. Thank you.
No, thank you, Joanna. So Sharon.
Yeah, hi. So there was a couple of areas that really hit home for me. One being, I am a Black female scientist. So even being in the room with other scientists, you know, I present, I'm published. And to go to meetings or conferences, and I'm sitting in a room and I have people say, oh, can you go get me the coffee, or can you make some copies for me, or whatever? And I have to let them know who I am. And I shouldn't have to do that. Or when I do meet people that I've, you know, had conversations with, and I meet them face to face, and oh, I didn't know you were Black. You know, it's, you know, you didn't sound like you were Black. You know, so I mean, this is 2023, and I face these things, and it's unbelievable. And I should not have to continue to prove myself and to who I am, and show or prove that I'm worthy to be in a room or sitting at a conference table or presenting to people who have or hold the same degree that I do.
Thank you, Sharon. That is such an important point that you're bringing out. And you know, what's interesting about your example is that it's hard to tease out, you know, when you're asked as the scientist in the room, can you go make copies? Many women talk about being asked to bring coffee. It's hard to tease out, is that based on gender or is that based on race? But the bottom line is, as you're saying, you shouldn't have to deal with that. Many people refer to what you're describing there, Sharon, as microaggressions. And I always share that I don't call them microaggressions anymore. I call them macroaggressions because even though they're not outwardly physically violent, they do speak to a kind of almost existential violence around who you are and how you're presenting yourself and who you are within the situation. And what it also points to is the ways that the organization itself is lacking. And I consider that macro. It's a macro aggression that there are not more women of color as scientists. It's a macro aggression that people within an organization view women of color through a lens of servitude. And so I think that what you bring out is so key in those ways. And thank you for sharing that. Christy's also sharing that she's had similar comments made. And many of us can have experienced that. But again, when we have this intersection of race and gender, it can be very difficult to tease out, where is this coming from? And where would the interventions be? How would you intervene? And how would the organization address it? Okay, so I'm just going to move forward a little bit. And I really do value everyone that's sharing, especially the people too that I'm not able to get to in the chat, but the people that are, brave enough to unmute and share your, these very important, vulnerable experiences. I really do appreciate that. And I do not take that lightly, that sharing. So I just want to move on and kind of, again, we talked about aligning terms and why that's very, very important to do. And so one of the things, some of the terms that I point to are basic definitions around what is prejudice, what is discrimination, and what is anti-Blackness. And I talk about prejudice as, and we all know that prejudice is basically a preconceived judgment or opinion, often based on limited information. So it's a way that we view a person before we actually know much about the person. So the experiences that we were just hearing about were related to prejudice, right? There was a prejudice around who's a scientist and who's not a scientist. So Sharon was experiencing prejudice. Now, we all have prejudices and we all enact those prejudices, whether we realize them or not. Some people refer to it as our unconscious bias. But we all have to, it's almost wired into us, make decisions about who are safe people, who are not safe people. If we're walking down the street, can we safely cross the street with that? Can we safely stay on the side of the street with that person coming toward us, or do we have to cross? We're going on very limited information, which could be what that person looks like. But we're wired to keep ourselves safe in that way. So some of us who are women may see a big man coming toward us and decide, I'm going to cross the street, even though we might not realize that that might be the person who actually protects us on the street, right? But because of that prejudice and that need to keep ourselves safe, we make that move. Now, prejudice often happens in areas that don't concern safety. And this is where it becomes a problem, where now we're looking at someone across a desk that we're trying to hire, and how are our prejudices operating then? So we do want to make sure that we're aware of our biases and are aware of our prejudices, but we're not evil people just because we have prejudice, right? So that's something that's important to keep in mind. We do want to check our prejudices. We want to be reflexive and reflective about our prejudices. So discrimination is what occurs when we treat someone unfavorably because they're of a certain race or because of certain personal characteristics associated with race. So obviously this is racial discrimination. And we have the EEOC. This is where that definition comes from. So, so discrimination is a different level of prejudice, right? Because now we're allowing our prejudice to impact the outcomes for other people across the table from us, from other people who we're now judging. And so this is important to understand this key difference between prejudice and discrimination. And then anti-Blackness is a particular form of discrimination. It's a particular form of prejudice. And I point to it because anti-Blackness is rooted in the American fabric. And the rest of us as people of color, as white people, we often have to fall into what is often referred to as a Black-white binary, which the US tended to operate on initially. It was either you're Black or you're white, and there were very strict definitions around who could be identified as Black and who could be identified as white. And most of that was done to protect whiteness as a privileged class. And so even though people tend to think, okay, but there's prejudice against a lot of different races, yes, there is definitely that. It's important, again, when we think reflexively, to think about our particular cultural and social context as the United States, which formed its prejudices and its discrimination based on anti-Blackness. And I think that's a really important point to bring out. And it's why when we see outcomes, we could look at medical outcomes, we can look at educational outcomes, we could look at outcomes around health, we can look at outcomes around poverty, and we'll see an overlap with Blackness and the negative outcomes. We'll see that overlap, not because Black people are inherently bad, but because that there are structures in place at all of those levels that discriminate against Black people. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. However, there are other forms of discrimination, and I think it's really important that we always acknowledge that through an intersectional lens, we acknowledge that those different forms of discrimination exist and they impact people differently. So homophobia, transphobia, sexism, these are just examples of different forms of other types of discrimination. And these are not just prejudices. It's not just, I don't like gay people. It's also, I'm enacting policies that negatively impact gay people. And because of intersectionality, some of those gay people will be Black, some of them will be white, some of them will be, Latinx, Latine. So it's really important for us to understand that as we look at these areas of discrimination, that we're looking at them from this lens that acknowledges that some people will be impacted by more than one of these lenses. So just like to bring out these terms and to kind of also see from you if you experience or you struggle with differences in terminology, differences in definition that then thwart the work that you try to do, right? Ken is celebrating, oh great, defining basic themes and terms, because we celebrate that, we need that, because sometimes we think we're doing the work of anti-racism, or we think we're doing the work of being an ally, and we're not doing that work from a space of really understanding the terms in similar ways. So again, this is something that you could put into the chat if you'd like, ways that some of these terms or terminology has proven a challenge for you as you begin to go about doing the work. So one thing that that becomes very evident when we think about, again, the terminology is that first we come to some common definitions, but then we come to some direct action within our institutions. And so it's not enough to do the anti-bias training, because what that does is that attempts to change individuals. So again, it doesn't mean we don't do it, but we do it beyond trying to change individuals. Because when we move beyond a look at the individual, we begin to focus on, well, if we only look at the individual, we focus on individual psychology or biases. And this is actually proven to be ineffective. I saw these headlines, and as a diversity advocate, as a DEI consultant, I became concerned. I looked at those headlines and was like, what if diversity training is doing more harm than good? Why doesn't diversity training work? And I became a little bit alarmed looking at the headline. But when I read these two articles, I saw that they weren't saying that diversity training fails, But what they're saying is that a single focus approach to diversity training is less effective. And when we look at personal or professional development, we need to use a multi-pronged systemic approach in order to really affect change within an organization. And so when we look at these headlines, rather than be alarmed by them, we read more deeply and we see exactly what are they saying that is ineffective. So I'm going to, within that, when I read, it said, Dr. Robert Livingston suggested that it's more important to accurately diagnose an organization's specific problems with DEI and to come up with concrete strategies for solving them than it is to attempt to change the attitudes of individual employees. So how many of you have been called into an organization and been asked, please do a workshop for our employees because they're having issues with bias? And that's all that you're asked to do. But then you look at the organization itself and you see, wait a minute, there's stuff coming from the top here. There are structures in place. There are policies in place. There are practices in place that are causing these issues of bias to bubble up. And what we really need to do and think about is how do we transition those policies into ones that are more inclusive? So it says, the second article says, in isolation, diversity training does not appear to be effective, but large corporations and big universities are developing multi-pronged diversity initiatives that tackle not only implicit biases, but structural discrimination, right? Which is what we all acknowledge is the problem. So I would just like for you to really think about your role within your organization. And you can think for yourself, are you emerging, developing, or transforming in your role as a diversity leader? So an emerging person is someone who is just beginning to recognize diversity, inclusion, and equity as a strategic priority, and you're beginning to build some efforts around DEI at your organization. Someone who's developing is a person who's focused on ensuring the developmental and institutional and individual capacity to sustain the diversity and inclusion and equity efforts. So this person not only understands what DEI is, but you're working on yourself to develop your own capacity to sustain it, but you're also working on the organization's effort to sustain it. And then finally, someone who's transforming is fully integrating DEI into the fabric of your work. So if you're already the DEI leader or the DEI person, then this is you already. But if you're not the DEI person, are you really integrating DEI into all of the work that you do? So I think we can put this poll up now for us to understand this on different levels. And let's go straight to leadership. Let's do the leadership poll. So I'd like to know how many of you see yourself as a leader for advancing diversity, inclusion, equity at your organization, and that you encourage your colleagues to engage in diversity work. So please rate yourself on the poll that's up now as emerging, developing, or transforming. Are you beginning to be a leader? Are you beginning to sustain some aspects of leadership? Or are you being a leader around a broad range of initiatives within your organization? So let's have you rate yourself. And I saw people beginning to rate yourself in the chat, and you can do that as well. And I'm going to give you a minute now just to rate yourself, how you see yourself within your organization as emerging, developing, and transforming. Because again, the reflexive piece begins with yourself, right? You have to begin with who you are and where you see yourself before you can think about others. Mira says, I'm so blessed to work in an agency run by Black women who understand this work deeply. They support our work, they support our self-care, and because I'm also an artist, they have given me the freedom to integrate my art and curation of art and its intersection of equity and healthy communities. That is great. I agree with Trina. That is really wonderful, and you are blessed to work in such an organization. What about others of us? Where are we? So I think I'll stop the poll right now and see the results. Okay, so many of us are acknowledging that we're still either emerging or developing in terms of leadership, right? We're still acknowledging that we have a bit of a ways to go. And I see that as very important, as a very important thing to acknowledge, because when you do acknowledge that, then you can point to the areas where you would need to grow. I think this becomes a moment of awareness. And some of you see yourself as transforming. It's almost like we have a bell-shaped curve here of people that are emerging, many people that are developing, and some people that are at that transformative stage of leadership within your organizations. So thank you for sharing that. And where do we go next? I think where we go next is to then look at our organization. Now we can say, and there won't be a poll for this, but I will ask you to think about, does your organization, is it emerging where your staff is just beginning to understand what DEI, DE and I are, or are they developing where they're beginning to implement some parts of DE and I, or are they transforming where they're actually including this work? They can articulate why it's important they're including it in their forms of education. I see people requesting the rubrics, and what I'm going to do is make those rubrics available to you. But they are part of the NERCHE group. These are their rubrics. So I have borrowed these rubrics and they have them. This is just one aspect of the rubric, and they have very many rubrics that you can look at. So, so after you do an assessment of yourself, where do you think your organization is? Is your organization invested in DEI? Do people understand what it is? Are people moving even to anti-racism? Because there is a difference between DEI and anti-racism. And are people making that jump to anti-racism rather than just focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then what are some incentives and rewards that your organization is implementing for those people who do have that labor tax that was referred to earlier, where BIPOC are usually the ones leading these initiatives? What is your organization doing to reward or incentivize DEI? And how is your organization assessing DEI, your DEI initiatives? Also, how are you assessing the DEI practices that you put into place, the interventions that you put into place? All of this will lead to that structural change. Is it part of staff evaluations? Is it part of hiring documents? These are all important areas that we want to see this DEI lens. So I just want to share with you as kind of my parting words, some of the guiding principles that guide my work. I saw Tandra brought up guiding principles earlier, and I do have several that guide my work. And as I talk about mine, you can talk about yours. You can go ahead and put yours in the chat. But one of the most important aspects of the work that I do is that I feel that the DEI work needs to be value driven. So rather than being something that is added on to an organization needs to say, we have particular values and this DEI work is part of the values that we hold. What we saw with successful organizations that led DEI initiatives that went beyond being performative is that those who embedded DEI into their value system were more able to defend their DEI initiatives. So they weren't just saying, we're doing DEI because we think it's important right now, but they were able to say, we value all of our employees. We value every employee having a voice. And because we value every employee having a voice, we move toward inclusivity. So when you can defend your DEI initiatives by the values of the organizations, then I think that really drives the DEI initiatives at an organization. Appreciative inquiry. So we can critique our organizations all day, right? We can say, this is what they're doing poorly, but what are your organizations doing well that you can have some inquiry around and build upon? So sometimes we do need to take structures and just completely deconstruct them. But other points, we do have some very important things that we can build on that the organization is already doing well. So it's important to build on those strengths. Prioritize anti-racism. So I just hinted at that earlier, is that we can go beyond saying we want to be diverse to saying we want to be anti-racist. We want to actively work to make our organization equitable. And when you prioritize anti-racism, then you actually create the environment to welcome a diverse workforce. So an example is just at the organization where I work, we were working on a policy to include trans women into our organization, but we hadn't looked at structural changes that we needed to make to support trans women in our organization. And so we really needed to think about how are we defining womanhood? What structures do we have in place? What does our physical environment look like? How are we using language? How are we allowing people to use or their personal pronouns? We really had to do a shift to prioritize making that work meaningful for trans women. And so when we prioritize anti-racism, we're saying we're going beyond diversity to include actively working against racism. Experiential learning. We need to understand that people learn from working together. And so the more opportunities that we build for people to not only work together in teams, but work together with this meaningful language and conversation around issues of race, gender, and all of our other forms of social groups. When we have those meaningful conversations and connections and experiences, we learn and grow and we break down our implicit biases. So context matters. We always have to understand that things don't happen in a vacuum, and that when we see things occur, they occur within a particular historical and social context that cannot be ignored. And structural change, we're not just focusing on individual interactions. So please, I talked about before being brought in just to do an anti-bias workshop. That's not enough. What are you going to do beyond that? What's the structural change that then impacts how that bias operates? Communication is key. One of the things that I'm always asked is, how can I better communicate my DEI initiatives? How can I better communicate that this is important to me? How can I communicate to my staff that I care about them? How can I communicate to my students that I'm taking all of their perspectives into consideration? So communication really becomes key and needs to be focused on as an aspect of DEI change. And then the point I already made about the micro is not macro. The microaggressions they indicate areas where we need to focus on issues of belonging and inclusion that then lead to issues of equity. So those are my key kind of values that I would like to leave with. I would love for you to put some of those in the chat that you have as well. And then the final kind of quote that I'll lead with is from Bernice King, who's the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. And I really do love this tweet that she tweeted out back in 21, around the time of the January 6th incident. She said, "Kindness matters, but kindness does not equal justice. Civility counts, but calling for civility is not the humane response to injustice. Justice is. Love is essential, but love is not a passive weeping bystander. Love puts in the work." And I love that quote because it points to the fact that being kind and being civil and being loving are all very, very important, but they're not enough. We actually need to put in the work toward justice. And I think her father really said that well, that peace is not passive. Lisa, you took the words right out of my mouth. Love is not passive. love is and peace is something that needs to be fought for and worked for. So thank you very much for your time. I'd like to open it up for questions, for comments. And I really want to thank you for your sharing. I really value the sharing, and I always learn from the sharing. So thank you so much.
Oh, Dr. Now, my fingers are like on fire over here because I was taking so many notes. Thank you for that. I wanted to just kind of ask a few follow-up. We've got a question that was asked anonymously that we'll get to. And I just want to remind everyone that if you want to raise your hands, excuse me, please do so. We would love, love, love to bring you on live. To even if you had a comment or an observation, doesn't necessarily have to be a question, but yes, that was amazing. So as you were talking, there were a couple of thoughts that came to mind that I wanted to ask, which is this idea of measurement. How do we measure, right? How do we measure inclusion? How do we know that we're doing well, or at least progressing? As you talked about that emerging to the developing, what are some barometer gauges that we can use when we start to look at measurement?
So I love the rubrics because that is the beginning of measurements. And so I'm actually going to put in the chat to everyone the link to the broader rubric. It's multifaceted, that rubric. And it's focused on higher education. So those of you in other fields, I think, you're going to use it. You might want to tweak this or use a different rubric, but I love to use these rubrics as not just a point for us to critique our organizations, but as a point for us to jump off for our appreciative inquiry and our conversations around where does our organization need to move from here. So that's part of it. These rubrics are great. And I think that we can look at that and do a self-assessment of our organization. And that's key. As we begin to do the work, we have to build evaluation into every part of what we do. So I'm always talking about when you design an intervention, or when you design a program, build how you're going to evaluate that program into the design of the program. So you want to have opportunities for people to share back, to give an outcome, to you might have something that goes beyond a survey, because I think these surveys are very important. I think we do climate surveys, for example, and people are checking boxes, and that, again, it gives us a one snapshot. But I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm always interested in what's behind those numbers. What are people saying behind those numbers? what are they experiencing behind those numbers? So that's where it goes into really interviewing people. It goes into, as you as you begin to have these work committees be put together, that you're assessing how that community is moving forward. You're giving lots of opportunities for the people in that community to say, here's some feedback on how this is going. Build that feedback loop into the design of whatever program you're creating, and go beyond the quantitative measures to the qualitative interviewing, and also consider products and outcome. So you don't just have to consider, okay, people said this on a survey. You can say, this department built this, or they came up with this policy, or they now have, and remember, policies can often stay on shelves. So it's not just about building the policy, but it's looking at how is this policy actually engaged with? How is it enforced? How is it operationalized? So build in those opportunities for work groups to come up with products that you can point to as outcomes of the work, and go beyond a quantitative measure as an outcome of the work.
Excellent. Oh, excellent. Thank you. I want to just read the question that was posted anonymously, which reads, what would be some examples of structural change that you've implemented or seen that really made a difference in an organization?
So one organization that I was working with, their key outcome was that they had a few outcomes, but the one I'll highlight right now is they started knowing that they had a lot of employees who were experiencing macroaggressions, microaggressions. They had a lot of employees, particularly African-American employees, who were dissatisfied with their experiences on the job. And they're kind of putting their heads down, right? We all know this. We put your head down, we go to work, we go home, and we become ourselves. And so that was the experience of that workplace. What they began to institute was a way for the organization to get feedback from employees about what they were experiencing, because they saw some real gaps in their leadership lines. So it wasn't clear who reports to whom on a particular project. It wasn't clear who you should, quote unquote, complain to. And I use the word complain advisedly, because I don't look at complaint as negative, and complaint can be taken as negative. But it became unclear, who do I report my complaint to, or who do I give my feedback to? And so the organization did some shifting for their, what they were calling complaint procedure. And again, I challenged them on the word complaint, because when we think of the complainer, we think of them as the problem, as opposed to thinking of what they're complaining about as the problem. And so there became some shifts in the ways that feedback was given within the organization, which then led to some shifts in the ways that that was taken up. And what I hope is that the organization would continue to see that feedback loop as a way of shifting their practice and shifting their policies to make it better for larger groups of people.
Excellent. I did have one question, which I hear oftentimes from lots of organizations that are getting people that are pushing back, right? Somebody said that was going around in their work group, this idea of, when you go woke, you go broke. So there was a lot of resistance, to this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And not just that it was kind of tokenism, but the idea that when you look at it, too much time was being spent, right, on this idea of equity, on this idea of, inclusion. And so for those that are resistant, right, to the work of DEI, which, by the way, I agree, I think it's everybody's job, not just that one lonely person, that is experiencing racial battle fatigue, because they're burdening all of the DEI work. But for those that are resistant to it, what are some thoughts around that for individuals within organizations? What can they do there?
So I have a couple thoughts about that. One thought is, one thing that we've noticed within DEI work is that we tend to want to bring along the resistant people. And maybe we don't need to. What we see is that we often have a bell-shaped curve, right? Where there are people who are very resistant on one end, and on the other end, there's the people with the fatigue. They're always on all the committees, right? And then there's that middle group, and that middle group is the group that's like, they're not resistant, but they might not see that sense of urgency. So I always talk about building a sense of urgency if it doesn't already exist. How are you building that sense of urgency so that those people in the middle see it? And then you move those people along. Because often what we tend to do is focus on the resistors, and we're like whack-a-mole, right? Every time that resistant feedback comes, we hit that. But if we instead look at what are we actually trying to do, and are we leading with our values? Because the other thing that we can always repeat back to our resistors is the mantra of our values. So we could say, at such and such organization, we value all employees' voices. So if that's your mantra, then when someone comes up with that resistance, you can say, I hear you. And at our organization, we value all voices. And so as much as we want to hear your voice, we want to hear the voices of others. So whatever that value is, when you can keep pointing back to it as a mantra, and I really think it's important to make those values visible, short, and succinct, and posted, so that people enact them regularly. So we can try to move the people in the middle and I saw someone said the movable middle.
Malia, yes, our good friend Malia, who has presented for us before.
Move those people, right? Because the resistors will always be there. And also my second part is, how can we redefine what success looks like? Does success look like moving everyone? Or does success look like we're seeing some strategy change, some policy change, some practice change? Maybe people move themselves out, and what we often have are the people that see it's not diverse here, I don't belong here, I can't make this work. So the diverse people, the people who are people of color, move out. But what if we make it an organization that values diversity and inclusion so much that the people that don't value that say, I don't fit here, I don't belong here, maybe I belong somewhere else? Because the other part is, how are you infusing your diversity mission in your hiring, in your job descriptions, in your performance evaluations, in those aspects, so that those people that need to be brought along, you might not have to say to them, are you racist or not? But you can say, what have you done to look at methods of reaching out to a diverse range of applicants for this position that you're hiring for? Those are key behaviors that you can point to, rather than pointing to moral failings or attitudes of individual people.
Brilliant. And that's usually what I tell when I work with executives. I say it's like a relationship. You got to be willing to let go when it doesn't serve you, and that's the thing. They're like, oh, but this person's been here, but what happens is we spend so much time and energy and resources on that 2%, 5%, whatever it is. And I always say, spend it on the 95% building the culture, and those, they'll kind of weed themselves out, if you would. So I love that point. I think that's brilliant. I wanted to just bring up, someone had asked the idea about, can you share your thoughts on DEIA? And we always sometimes forget that accessibility. That's a really critical one. But the question was, and this was a question actually from Ken, can you share your thoughts on DEIA practitioners changing the name from, say DEI to some other name that is easily acceptable? Isn't that an interesting? Yeah.
DEIA, it's something that's easily acceptable besides DEIA. I think I need to clarify that.
And Ken, if you would like to come on, would love to bring you on. I want to make sure I am interpreting your comment correctly. So Ashley, if you wanted to unmute Ken for him to just share, that would be great. Good morning, Ken.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Kimberly. What an outstanding presentation, and thank you for adding the piece about it's a big piece for us in transportation, and I think by extension for every industry, right? We're missing a piece, but my question was really strategies that are being used by practitioners to make the whole idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility acceptable. In the case of work or Florida movement, we've changed names. And I was in a discussion with a group of practitioners, and we weren't very sure. Some say call it what it is, so you identify those that have a problem with what is factual. And others says alternatively, you can mask it so long as it gives you a leg up. It gives you an opportunity to keep doing the work you're doing. But that debate still continues, and I wanted to see what your take is. Is it okay to just change the name? And does that lead to some kind of performative DEIA? Or is it okay as a strategy? Your thoughts?
So, I think the strategy that's going to work for your organization is an important one. And if accessibility is being left out of the equation, and you're finding that within your organization, you need to put a highlight on that, then it's fine to add that the A to the DEI. There are so many different acronyms that so many different organizations are using, and I use DEI as a shorthand, almost as like an umbrella for the other forms of inclusion that need to exist. Because diversity, when we're talking about diversity, again, it's the intersectionality of that diversity, right? You are going to have accessibility issues within diversity. You're going to have it within inclusion. When I talked about the bathroom situation for trans students, you do have to think about how you're shifting that. But what I also go to is legality, and making things accessible can become a civil rights issue for the groups that need that accessibility. And so we do need to make sure that we highlight accessibility for those groups, because it becomes a civil rights issue in employment. And so I don't have a problem with naming. I think, at my university, we were like, should we be DEI, EDJ, DEIB, what should we be? And, for me, it's about what is your value system? What are you valuing and what do you need to highlight? And those are the areas that you will put in your acronym. But I think what's more important is what's the value system behind and how are you enacting that acronym?
Yeah, and the one thing I do find, thank you so much, Ken, for that, is I will tell you the one that gets resistance, though, is when we use words like social justice. I'll say, this is, and they're like, oh no, this is a diversity issue. And I'm like, I find it interesting that people have such a visceral reaction to the word social justice.
Yeah.
And so that's the one where, we've had a couple of organizations we've been working with, like, we can't put that in our language. People won't understand that. People won't, align with that. So I'm like, so that's the one where I think I see the most pushback, and I'm always curious as to why. It must have a more political undertone, than just diversity, equity, and inclusion. But that's the work of diversity, equity, inclusion is social justice in nature. So yeah, so that's
Anti-racism is the other term that gets strong pushback.
I was just going to say that, anti-racism. And what in those, are you seeing that more in education, or are you seeing organizations that are comfortable using anti-racism?
Ironically, I see more comfort with anti-racism in education than I'm seeing in other industries. And often that, and it can depend on where in education as well, because often organizations have pushback from their boards. And so if their board is not as far along as the leadership of the organization, that's where there can be some pushback on terms like anti-racism. So then people begin to think about diversifying their boards. But yeah, I think that depending on the industry, certain terms will be more acceptable than others. Social justice is a term that's fine for some non-governmental organizations or nonprofits, but then you go to some schools or some organizations, especially corporations, then the bottom line, the dollar bottom line becomes more important than social justice initiatives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful. Did we have, Ashley, any more hands that were raised? I didn't see any, but I wanted to make sure we didn't miss anyone's comments that wanted to speak. So Ashley, could you unmute and let me know if we have any other hands? I would love to make sure we get everybody's questions answered.
I don't see any more right now, so I think we're good.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Nao, that was such an edifying conversation. I am thrilled to have you as part of the DLA community this morning. And I got to tell you, Tandra said thank you also. She had to run to her next meeting. So apologies that she was not able to, wish you farewell as well. But we're hoping that you'll join us again. You had such wonderful salient points that I just thought, really was on track with what we're trying to, as an organization, kind of, embed in our own community, and for people to continuously learn. You're getting bravos from Christine and,
thank you.
And Malia had said, by the way, just so you know, Sergio gave you quite a few bravos as well.
Thank
Same
you.
with Angela Salazar. So you did a wonderful job. Lots of folks are saying they love this. And I love that you were able to, I agree with Malia, look at the chat and keep the presentation going. I'm like, I could barely focus on the chat because it was so robust. So thank you so much for that. And we look forward to having you join us in another environment such as this in the near future. So thank you so much.
I thoroughly enjoyed my time with you all. And I want to thank those of you who shared so much in the chat and who unmuted and shared verbally. So thank you so much. I really, really value the community and the work that you do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we couldn't do this work without all of you. So thank you so much for those that attended today, and your comments were absolutely wonderful. Thank you to Tandra Richardson, who did have to drop off. She is doing such a phenomenal job on our education committee. The work we do here would not be possible without important contributors, such as our volunteers. Thank you, Ashley, always for volunteering to run the back end, our sponsors, and also our DLA Board of Director members. Their continued guidance and leadership of the organization over the past 20 plus years is imperative to helping us move the needle on social justice. And I saw in the chat someone said, I don't care what you call it. I think it was Trina said, I don't care what you call it, just do the work. So yes, just do the work. Again, thank you to Ashley Troyer, who was helping with the back end, and also Maria Radloff, who is our webmaster that puts all of this content on our DLA YouTube page and on the website. So to the question that was asked earlier, this will be available for you all to view again. So you'll be able to see the slides again in about a week on the DLA website. A special thank you to Mayo Clinic, and our co-founder of DLA, Mr. Marion Kelly, was on earlier, but he had to drop as well. So just wanted to mention him, and also to Channel 12 News for supporting DLA and its year-round programming. At this time, I would just love to invite you all to join us next month. So we've got another workshop coming up in October, leading to our November conference as well. So I just want to make sure you guys have that. We'll go ahead and put the link on there. You can always go to our participate page if you ever want to see what upcoming workshops we have. Registration is open for that, so make sure you register. And I just have a little plea for you. As you know, Diversity Leadership Alliance is a nonprofit organization. If you have enjoyed today's workshop and its content and found value in what you heard and what you walked away with, would you consider supporting DLA further by making a donation? Your donations help us continue to keep this an equitable space with these vital dialogues, and keeps workshops like this complimentary to the community. So in the chat area, Ashley will drop a link there that you can click on it and make a donation of any amount. We would certainly appreciate it. And your donations may be tax deductible. Please make sure you are consulting with your tax advisor. Again, another special thank you to our webinar presenter, Dr. Kimberly Nao. We're humbled and grateful for your valuable time and contribution. And I would love for you all to check out the next workshop. As I mentioned, it's called Creating Action and Impact by Donating Dollars to DEI Initiatives, right? It's time to make the dollars align. And that's on October 12th with Nona Lee. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. We don't take your time for granted, and we're humbled that you continue to be part of the DLA family. We look forward to seeing you all in October. And in the meantime, would you do me a great big favor and take care of yourself? And more importantly, take care of each other and the community. Until next time, cheers from DLA. Bye-bye now.